And I'm your host here, and we're being joined today by Alex Krainer, who is market orientated, like expert, geopolitical commentator, who works in a fascinating combination of finance, geopolitical analysis, and someone who I think has some great commentary about some of the macro movements that we're seeing. And Alex, we've been planning this chat for a while now, so it's great to finally have you on the show. I mean, what's going on with the Iran war? I'm covering it on a daily basis. The markets keep doing different things. Trump doesn't seem to know what he's doing. There doesn't seem to be any clear direction with this, but we can dig all to that in a second. Right now, as we're on the 21st day of this conflict, how are you feeling about the situation?
Well, it looks like a big old train wreck, basically, that's still gathering, that's still escalating. It doesn't look like it's going to be a short-term event. It looks like it's going to drag on. It appears that Trump may not be in charge. It's increasingly entrenched consensus is that Israel is driving the train, and it seems that at every possible opportunity the Israelis are escalating, and they think that they're escalating because basically Israel has nothing left to lose. So, as far as they're concerned, the worse the better. And why is that? Because it seems to me that the worse the situation gets, the more difficult it is for Israel's Western allies to stand aside, to stand on the sidelines. And so I think that the objective is to try to unite the world behind Israel and against Iran. And yesterday's development suggests as much, because Trump allegedly was against striking the Qatari gas field, the Pars gas field, which is shared between Qatar and Iran. They operated jointly. Well, somebody struck those fields, Israelis apparently. But they probably could not have done it without US support, which is a strange thing in itself. And so the Iranians retaliated, and they destroyed gas fields in Saudi Arabia and in Qatar.
So,
and yeah, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to ask you on that point, because Trump came out with that pretty blunt truth post, social post, whatever, describing, it was pretty critical of the strike, right? So you're saying that America probably was still involved, even though Trump was like surprised by it. So does that only expose how much more?
I'm saying that Trump's truth social post doesn't really convince me.
Okay.
And then there's a whole hierarchy below Trump. He's the supposedly commander in chief, but the war effort is being managed by CENTCOM. Does he control CENTCOM and the people who are running the show from there? I don't know that. He obviously can't say, well, it wasn't me. I didn't really mean this, but there's some people down there, rogue elements. He has to always portray himself as fully in control. And whatever happens, he has to own it, because otherwise the message is, I'm not in control. Other people are in control. And that's, as far as he's concerned, that's much worse than owning all these horrible escalations. So I don't know what to think about Trump, whether he controls the situation or doesn't control the situation. But it's very, very obvious that everything that's going on is not only not in the interests of the United States, it's contrary, it's adversarial to the interests of the United States. But it suits the Israelis, because they are in, an existential agony. They're engaged in wars on 8 fronts or 9, or I don't know, I lost count. They're surrounded by hostile populations. They're on the back foot. Their country, their economy, their system is being destroyed. Their military is exhausted and largely unwilling to fight anymore. And so what to do but to drag the whole world into this war? I don't understand the mystery of how they managed to bring the United States into it, because the pressure on Trump to go to war against Iran has been a consistent thing, even in his first administration. We had the 2019 incident when Iranians downed a drone in the Persian Gulf, and then there was great pressure for Trump to attack Iran, to bomb them. And he said no. And then if Antony Blinken was telling the truth, which, maybe, they were trying to, the Israelis were trying to finagle Obama into attacking Israel, and Obama said no. And, Obama knew not to get into the quagmire. Trump knew not to get into the quagmire in 2019. This year, since he entered the White House, he's been obviously trying to avoid getting enmeshed in that war. And why and how he pulled the trigger is a mystery. They gave us a variety of explanations. It changed a number of times, but at this point, it seems that most people believe that it was Israel, that Israel was the instigator. Now, why the United States followed? Marco Rubio, in the immediate aftermath, he was saying, well, the Israelis were going to attack, and then if they did and we didn't go along, then our troops in the region would be in jeopardy. So we had to, kind of front run the situation and join the Israeli attack. Which just the whole thing seems completely bonkers and surreal. But here we are, and it seems that it continues to escalate, and I don't see any reason to think that it will not escalate, that it will come to some kind of a quick resolution. Because from the Iranians' point of view, they don't really have any reason to go back to the status quo, because the status quo has been 120 years of continuous harassment, invasions, occupations, 2 famines that killed tens of thousands of Iranians, proxy wars, direct wars, sabotage, acts of sabotage, regime change operations, and absolutely crushing maximum pressure sanctions that have suffocated Iran's economy. And so why should they go back to that? For what reason? They have no reason to go back to that. So I think that they will try to completely clean up their region. They will try to evict Western interests from the region, not just from their immediate neighborhood. I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't activate their whole axis of resistance back into action, and that in the near future, we might even see a land invasion into Israel.
Wow. That's a bold prediction. But, some other people that you read the mainstream media or you read a lot of specific outlets, and the claim is that Iran's, military capacity is being degraded. I think Netanyahu said just yesterday that the Israelis had destroyed all remaining production means to create ballistic missiles, right? Which I think is pretty big propaganda. Why would the Israelis say that then, aside from propaganda? But what do you think is the reality of the situation on the ground?
Well, it's not complicated. If you try to portray your enemy as weak and losing and, they're finished, then you're emboldening their enemies. Then you're, people who are standing on the sidelines might say, well, they're down, they're getting pounded, may as well join and scoop up the glory when the regime is finally defeated. So it's not complicated. But I think that Netanyahu has lied once or twice before, so it's, I don't know how many people are convinced by whatever he says. Iranians have been preparing for this for a very long time because they knew that this clash was coming. And so I would expect, they have proven themselves to be fairly competent in their conduct of foreign policy and their conduct of war. And so I expect that everything that's critically important to them is not out in the open for Israeli and American warplanes to bomb and destroy. And we've seen that they've left who knows what number of decoys, which are, inflatable military assets or things that they paint on the ground, and
rudimentary means like that.
yes, very rudimentary means, but they're effective because from the satellites they look like the real thing. You can't tell. And so they drop these bombs and missiles on this stuff, and they say like, yeah, we hit the target. And they say like, wow, like we've destroyed thousands of their launchers, helicopters, aircraft, what have you. But the real stuff is in the probably buried deep underground in all these tunnels that they've been building for 20 plus years. And so I think that they're very well protected. And then, I wouldn't, all these pronouncements like, oh, they're finished, we're just about to end them. But let's remember that this very same military machinery, which was arguably much more powerful 20 years ago, went into Iraq, they went into Afghanistan, they spent 2 decades trying to subdue the Taliban, and they failed. And then they spent 10 years trying to destroy the Houthis in Yemen, and they failed. And, Iran is not the Taliban. Iran is not Yemen. Iran is orders of magnitude more powerful. And in preparing for this conflict, they've not only prepared their military, they prepared their control and command structure, even to the point of taking into account that the central government in Tehran might be overthrown. It won't change a thing. They will continue fighting, and eventually whatever puppet government the West might try to install, they'll take care of that too. But let's not forget, 2+ years ago when regime of Bashar al-Assad was overthrown, significant parts, maybe the best parts of the Syrian Arab army didn't disband. Some of them went into Lebanon, and some of them went into Iraq. Whole tank divisions went into Iraq. So they're still somewhere. We might see them back in action. I don't know, but there's a reason why nobody until Trump dared attack Iran, even though we know from General Wesley Clark that Iran was due for a regime change by 2006. That was Wesley Clark's famous statement that, in 2001, they were planning to take down 7 countries in 5 years. So that's within 2006. And Iran was meant to be the last one in that series. Nobody dared attack Iran because they know that they can't overthrow the regime. American intelligence agencies were quite categorical in that sense. Even Trump's immediate military advisors, like Vice Admiral Fred Kemp, I think, Fred Catcher. Sorry, Fred Catcher. He was trying to warn, and he was the head of operation in the Joint Chiefs. And he was like, "Look, we can't do this. It's our lines of supply, logistics, our arsenals are empty. We can't possibly win." And Trump just sacked him. And then the National Security Agency, I think, the staff is down 90%. They were supposed to have 450 staff. Now they have about 40 some. Because I don't know, everybody who's not, rah rah rah, let's go to war, is out. And so all the people who stayed and who are still on board are, I think, a cult by this time. They're if you buy into the groupthink, you're in. If you don't, you're out. And we see that, even the very, very loyal Trump's director of national counterterrorism just resigned.
Yeah,
so
I know him.
It's not looking good. Whatever they put in the mainstream media, the real picture doesn't look good.
And I guess, like, Alex, from my perspective, there's this whole emphasis that obviously America's the most powerful military. It can beat Iran and it can be any country. But I feel that that misses the point, right? Because I want to bring it into the Strait of Hormuz specifically. This is an area where a fifth of oil supply goes through. We've just had this massive strike on Israel, on Qatar and the energy fields there. Debate around how much US knew about it, was involved, etc. But point being is that this is creating a scenario where we're basically going to see stagflation, right? We're going to have a terrible situation where inflationary pressure is here. Prices remain intensified levels, but there's no growth either because it's a supply side shock, right? So from your perspective, looking at the markets, like what's going through your mind? What is the Trump administration trying to do with the Strait of Hormuz?
I don't know that Trump administration has any idea what they want to do, because I think that the whole thing was predicated on the gamble that this would take 2-3 days, that it would that it would force the Iranians into submission, that they would accept Trump's terms and Israeli terms, and that would be the end of it. They obviously didn't expect this. They obviously didn't expect the closure of a gate of Hormuz, which is staggering because, that should have been the first thing that they should expect. And so now they're doing things like, oh, we're going to temporarily unsanction the Russians so that they can sell their oil, and that could relieve pressure on oil prices. And then, the Iranians have some oil in floating storage. I don't know, like 100 million barrels or so, allegedly. We'll unsanction Iranian oil. So we will allow our enemies to sell their oil just, to keep oil from going higher. And it reeks of desperation. It reeks of desperation. You should declare victory and just end the whole thing. Unsanction Russia, unsanction Iran, and let the world economy breathe. Otherwise, it's all getting suffocated. Of course, the Zionist element in the U.S. government will never allow this, and it seems that they are running the show. And then, if you look at the oil prices, we're now at about $110 a barrel, which sounds very high because only less than 3 months ago it was $60 a barrel. So the price has nearly doubled in 3 months. But if you look at the longer term history of oil prices, we were already at $120 in 2022. And we were at $140 a barrel in 2008. And that was without the closure of Gate of Hormuz, the Strait of Hormuz, right? Which is the greatest single disruption to the oil market ever in history of oil market. It eclipses the 19th. The oil price could go a lot higher than it is today. We don't know, but it is moving higher. These events, and this has kind of been my the focus of my professional career. These things tend to unfold over time as trends. So the price starts going higher, and it doesn't go to $200 overnight. It just moves, and these trends can span months or years, and where they can go, nobody can predict. But 4 years ago, in 2022, JP Morgan was predicting oil price at $380 a barrel.
Wow.
And that wasn't nothing to do with Iran. It was to do with the war in Ukraine. That didn't come to pass, but it tells you that there are many people who think something horrible and horribly disruptive can happen in the oil market. And then the British Ministry of Defense in 2012 was predicting that oil price would go to $500 a barrel. So, if we live, we will learn, we will find out. But what we're up against now is probably going to turn out a whole lot worse than it is right now. And it might cause irreversible changes in the global order, in global economic balances. Europe is in a world of trouble. the EU is still pushing to remove all of Russian energy supplies from the European markets. No change, same course, pedal to the metal, full speed ahead. And I think that at some point that could cause civil wars and revolutions on the continent.
Well, on that point, actually, Alex, the Belgium, is it Prime Minister, the leader, has said that, now is the moment to normalize ties with Russia. I've written and made some interesting videos about what this is doing for the Russian economy. And obviously one of the biggest winners, if not the biggest winner right now, at least from an energy sense, is Moscow, is Putin. How much do you think that the energy crisis will benefit Moscow, depending upon whether Trump wants to, take over, manage the Strait of Hormuz? What does that do for the rest of energy security and where not just NATO, Europe, but like other countries get their energy from? India's been absolutely devastated by this. A lot of Asia is suffering even more than Europe. So I'm just curious what you think that means for Moscow and energy security more broadly.
Well, it's obviously favoring Moscow because they are one of the world's largest exporters of crude oil and natural gas. So, at this point, the Russians would be fully in their right to say, okay, look, the disruption in Hormuz is now radically reduced the flow of oil to the global south, to India and China. And so even if the Europeans say like, all right, let's not hold grudges, water under the bridge, let's make nice, we'll buy your oil and gas, we'll reopen. The Russians can say, well, actually, there's great demand in the East from countries that are our friends and allies who have treated us well. Well, we will prioritize supplying their markets. If there's anything left over for you guys, maybe we can talk about it. But guess what? Maybe there won't be anything, and Putin has already said, he's already instructed actually companies like Gazprom to end completely supplies of natural gas to Europe. Europe wants to buy natural gas from the United States and from Qatar. Qatar is now producing exactly zero natural gas. And the Americans, they're in it for business, not for the love of Europeans. And we'll be paying through our noses for energy, and so I think that Europe is in a world of trouble, in a world of trouble that is very difficult to even envision at this moment. But I'm afraid that it's inevitable now.
So just quickly on that, I want you to obviously expand on your train of thought, but just quickly to tag into that is, how much do you think that this is about America's desire to control energy supply to Europe, to be the undisputed provider, right? To force Europe to be on America's side or to capitulate like that. Some people argue that's why the second pipeline was blown up. And I've forgotten the name of it now. Suddenly, the different pipelines were blown up, right? Because
Nord Stream.
Thank you. Having a moment of brain fog, but no. My point is like some people who are more skeptical of the whole situation argue that it was America's desire to want to retain monopoly over sort of energy security in Europe, keep the Americans in, the Soviets out, and the Germans down, or whatever the expression by the first Secretary General of NATO was, right? Do you think that there's a truth to that? Trump basically wants to manage the entire Strait of Hormuz and therefore dictate to everybody else the supply of oil and gas?
It may well be. It's hard to know because this is obviously not part of any official foreign policy doctrine that we can look at and say like, aha, look. But the incentives would be clear, because if you hold all those cards in your hand, then everybody has to come to you for solutions. Everybody, you make everybody dependent on you. And this is not necessarily something that the government officials think up in their, policy briefing sessions. But it could well be something that comes from the banking sector, because bankers have far and away the largest incentive in holding valuable collateral everywhere around the world. So Because what happens is if you hold valuable collateral, you can issue loans against it, right, to your clients. Companies like Halliburton and BP, Royal Dutch Shell, and so forth. Once you've issued a loan to your client, that loan becomes an asset on your balance sheet. So it directly enhances the wealth of your institution. And not only that, but these loans are repaid with interest, so they generate profits for you. They kind of draw wealth from around the world into your institution, to your shareholders, even though the actual wealth is in Saudi Arabia, in Iran, in Iraq, in the Caspian region, wherever, whatever it happens to be. And so this is the big incentive, which they will never tell us this. It took me a lifetime to work this out. Why is the United States the instigator of more than 80% of all wars from 1946 until now? We're talking about more than 160 wars in the world that the United States instigated. And then there's the probability that the war will be instigated in a resource-rich region is 10 times higher than in a not a research. So, the empirical data is very conclusive about this. But they can't, people wouldn't support this. So they can't come to the people and say, oh, we're going to go to war against Iran because they're number 6 or number 5 country in the world in terms of natural resource wealth. It's estimated at $30 trillion. So we're just going to take it from them. People would say no. But if you tell them, oh, the mullah, they're so evil, they're terrible people, we want to liberate the people of Iran, like we did the people of Libya and Syria and Iraq, Afghanistan, and so forth. Yeah, we want to bring them freedom and democracy. And these people are terrible. The mullahs are almost as evil as Saddam was and Bashar al-Assad before him. And, after him, and Gaddafi was a total madman. And the Taliban, they were terrible people. And Viet Cong also, and North Korean commies, and Manuel Noriega, and everybody's super evil. Everybody's super evil, and we always go to war to free the people from their evil overlords and bring them democracy and freedom, and McDonald's and crap like that.
Americanization.
But it always happens to be kind of very, very lucrative for the banking sector and their client corporations. And so that's the real incentive. Nobody would go, there's no democracy in Saudi Arabia, but nobody's proposing to go invade Saudi Arabia. There's no democracy in Qatar or Bahrain. Nobody's talking about bringing democracy to the people of Bahrain or Jordan or, any of these client regimes. It's only the ones that are not clients who want to be independent and left alone, and who happen to have natural resource wealth that we can, like that, convert into our own wealth by using it as the collateral for loans that we can issue to our clients. So that, that's the whole thing.
So very simply then, I've got a couple of blunt questions, Alex. What does this do to the petrodollar? Because there's been a lot of debate around, Saudi Arabia feeling less and less in love with the US. The Chinese, a good couple of years ago now, normalized ties or improved ties with the Iranians because of the Chinese. More countries are trying to do bilateral trade in their respective currencies. What does this do, in your opinion, to the petrodollar? Because the Saudis are obviously not happy with the Iranians retaliating, but this whole conflict was instigated by the Americans and Israelis on February 28th. So do you think that the Saudis are going to be looking at this, MBS is going to be looking at this and thinking, I've got to reevaluate my relationship with Washington?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And MBS has already been doing this. He's been already dealing with the Russians and with the Chinese. They've been already selling oil in yuan. They knew this was coming, but I think that this attack on Iran is the catalyst that could accelerate all this. It's not only that, but everybody saw what happened to Russian assets in the United States and in Europe. Well, mostly Europe. There's not so much, but basically got frozen out of their assets because of political questions, because of political conflicts. Well, if they're willing to do that to the Russians, who are, the world's largest nuclear power, what's stopping them to do it to the Saudis or anybody else? So they know that this is a risk, and they know that they have to diversify away from the United States. I think now, unless the United States and Israel somehow could manage to snatch a victory out of the jaws of defeat against Iran, I think it only catalyzes an accelerated collapse of the whole petrodollar system.
And what about debt? Right, we mentioned it earlier, and this is something that a lot of people touch on. But what about the capacity for the American government to continue building up the national debt? I think it was in the Wall Street Journal yesterday. There was a headline that stated, the Pentagon is seeking $200 billion. For context, for people watching and listening, the entirety of aid or funding given to Ukraine in the past 4 years, with a lot of back and forth and disagreements and tension, was 180. And, this was we're in 3 weeks in with this war, and we're already seeing that number surpassed with an additional $20 on top. So what does this do for people's confidence in the US as a sort of debt hub or something like that? Tricky question.
There isn't an immediate problem with that, because I don't know, the United States is now at some, let's call it 115, 120% debt to GDP.
Yeah.
Japan is at, I think, over 300%. So there's always going to be people who are going to say, like, hey, the Japanese could kick the can down the road for so much farther. We can do the same. And probably they are right to an extent, And then I think they understand, because, when you have an overhang of unpayable debts, you either have to default on them in one way or another, probably not an outright default to say, like, hey, we can't pay, we're not going to pay. But basically you start printing money out of thin air, and you start paying back those debts with just paper currency. And then you slowly end up diluting its purchasing power. So you've effectively defaulted through inflation, because you end up paying off your debts with worthless currency. Otherwise, you would have to bring new wealth into the system.
Right.
Which can happen in two ways. Either you have great increases in productivity in your system, so then you're able to pay down the debts actually by creating new wealth, or you have to go and plunder other people's wealth. Like, I don't know, maybe like, Venezuela's oil resources or Canadian oil resources, or you take Greenland, something like this. So I think they thought about that, and that part of the reason why Trump wants to take Canada and Greenland, and why they secured access to Venezuelan resources, is exactly for this reason. So the United States probably has a lot more maneuvering room than does the UK or European Union or Japan. But ultimately, they won't be able to prevent inflation from flaring up again. Only, I think that the United States is still much less vulnerable than the EU, Britain, and Japan. So I expect that in the near future, we will see very high rates of inflation in the UK and in Europe and Japan as well. And then, the United States might actually be able to, let's call it, engineer a softer landing. They will,
well, like an offer.
They will all fall into the same ravine, but the Americans will probably be able to cushion the blow to themselves with the bodies of the British and the Europeans and the Japanese.
Well, that's one way to put it, certainly. But Alex, I mean, you're vocally critical of the Western system, of Western foreign policy or intervention. But to be devil's advocate, what alternatives do the Chinese or the Russians really give? Because the Chinese seem very focused on their internal dealings. They never get involved. And regardless of what Russia has said about what's happening, they've not provided any support to the Iranians. So do you not think that there's a lot of talk by the countries that oppose the US system, but then won't actually do anything to challenge it?
It's a very, very delicate thing, It's I've listened to the most recent statements by Mr. Arakchi, the Iranian foreign minister, who said that the Russians are very supportive, that they have provided them certain kinds of support. The Chinese have also provided support to Iranians, access to their satellite imagery and fuel for chemicals that they use to constitute the solid rocket fuel for the building of their missiles, things like that. Maybe there's other things as well, but you see, if the Russians gave the Iranians or the Chinese their most advanced weapon systems, and if Iran suffers a defeat, then there's a risk that all of those systems will fall into the hands of their enemies.
Right.
And so it's not an easy decision to say, like, here, we're going to give you the 400s and S-500s. You can only do that and bring Russian troops along with it, among other things, not just to operate them, but to make sure that the systems are destroyed before they can fall into other people's hands. And then that makes it, that there's a risk that Russian troops there will end up being casualties in any war situation, which might end up creating public pressure for Russia to enter that war. Russians are already busy up to their eyeballs in Ukraine, so they don't need to spread themselves thinner. These are delicate decisions, I think, from the point of view of allies, and so they will seek to provide help, but the kind that will not unbalance their own foreign domestic policy, military preparedness, and so forth. Anything goes wrong in a war, governments can fall. So they're very, very afraid of those things, of such risks. And so this is why, you don't see Russians bringing their whole anti-aircraft systems and S-400s and the most advanced systems that they use in Ukraine. But there are other things that I think they can provide to the Iranians, and at least as far as the statements from official Tehran go, they consider that the Russians are helping them and the Chinese.
Oh, okay, very curious. Often you also reference the idea of multipolarity, right? The multipolar world and the US primacy, the US hegemon is coming to an end. But do you see that being more guaranteed with what's happening in Iran? Obviously, you can't predict conclusively, but this seems like an own goal for Trump. It seems like I don't really understand what is going on in his head, because this is going to decimate him at the midterms.
You're not alone, Piotr. Believe me.
No, I mean, but very simply, what do you think this does for the global order? And as I titled this conversation, is this going to trigger a global recession?
I think it will trigger global recession. I'm afraid that it might trigger global famine, or at least famine in large parts of the world. And I think it's going to force a change of the global order because it's making it obvious that the old, colonialist approach to hegemony can no longer work. They just cannot. I mean, if you couldn't tame the Taliban, what are we talking about? And then, when the Americans took Iraq, there's the 5-mile road between Baghdad and the Baghdad airport. And they were never able to secure it until they started paying the local militias to not attack them. So, controlling other countries by force, subduing them by force, it's very, very costly. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't pay. And I think that, once the United States realizes that they shot themselves in the face with this attack on Iran, it's going to force a rethinking. I think that as far as American people are concerned, there's no need for rethinking. They already elected Trump into office because they wanted an end to this imperial policy. 800, 900 military bases everywhere around the world, bludgeoning everybody into submission, constantly being at war everywhere. They wanted an end to this. Trump was promising that, but he didn't deliver. And I think that what he is going to deliver is a conclusive evidence that this is an obsolete approach to governing the world, and they will simply have to read the writing of the wall, make nice with other powers in the world like Iran, like Russia and China, like India. And as my friend Larry Johnson says, rather than being the global policeman, they will have to decide to become a polite guest at the global banquet, which will be a guest. I can see that. Polite, it'll take a while, but I think it's inevitably going to happen.
Okay, and as the final question for this session, I wish we could continue longer, but I know you had to have a hard start, so just have to have you back soon, Alex. Very refreshing conversation. Is simply, where do you see it going from here in the next, I don't even know, week, 2 weeks, a month? We talked about global recession, but what do you think more immediate? Are we going to see gold affect more prices, oil doing all sorts of things? What would you encourage people to focus on in the next short to medium time?
I would encourage them to make friends with their neighbors and to network in the local community, because that's far and away the most important element of resilience to weather any crisis. Because, economy can go on without money. Even if money dies, economy can go on as long as food comes out of the ground and people know how to bake bread and slaughter animals and fix leaky roofs and broken down cars. All of that can be done in the community by people who have adequate competences. But if you don't know who they are or where they are, you remain dependent on supermarkets and banks and large chains that don't care about you. And when the shelves go empty, that's you're facing a dismal future.
Very wholesome point to end on there, and I think sort of positive one, right? One we can take away from it. But Alex, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for your time today. If you haven't already, do subscribe, do follow Alex, and we'll see you all soon.